In 2019, Saudi Arabia carried out a chilling mass execution, beheading 37 people in just one day. Among the most heart-wrenching stories was that of Mutaba al-Swakat, arrested as a teenager. What makes his case even more harrowing is the brutal torture he endured before facing his tragic end. Here are some of the most disturbing death row executions around the world. Lethal injection was first introduced in Oklahoma in 1977. The method was considered a more humane alternative to older methods like hanging, firing squads, or the electric chair. The idea was simple: a combination of drugs that would be administered intravenously to induce unconsciousness, paralysis, and ultimately death. Now, the procedure involves 3 drugs, which are an anesthetic to render the inmate unconscious, a paralytic to stop muscle movements, and the last one to stop the heart. Yet what sounds clinical and straightforward on paper has proven far from foolproof in practice. One of the most disturbing incidents to occur was on April 29, 2014 in Oklahoma. Clayton Lockett, convicted of kidnapping and murdering Stephanie Naiman, was set to be executed. However, a botched procedure turned that execution into a nightmare. The intravenous line was improperly inserted, causing the drugs to infiltrate surrounding tissue instead of entering his bloodstream effectively. And as a result, he regained consciousness after the procedure had begun, writhing, groaning, and visibly struggling. Witnesses described this as chaotic and horrific. The execution, intended to last minutes, dragged on for 43 excruciating minutes before Lockett finally died of a heart attack. This sparked global outrage and reignited debates about the humanity and ethics of lethal injection. While supporters argue that it might be a necessary method for carrying out justice, critics question whether these procedures can ever be entirely free of pain or error. The Clayton Lockett case serves as a haunting reminder that even the most modern methods of execution can fail in shocking and distressing ways that really leave a lasting impact on both inmates and witnesses alike. Unlike the lethal injection, electrocution, better known as that electric chair, has a storied and controversial history. Developed back in the late 19th century, it was initially introduced as an alternative to hanging. The first use dates back to 1890 in New York, where William Kemmler became the first person executed by the electric chair. The method was born from a competition between Thomas Edison and George Westinghouse, with Edison promoting the use of alternating current (AC) electricity to demonstrate its lethal power. Ironically, this quest for humane execution methods had birthed one of the most chilling forms of capital punishment ever known. The process of this form of execution involves strapping an inmate to a wooden chair, with electrodes attached to their body, both on their heads and their feet. Then a high-voltage electrical current is passed through the body, causing cardiac arrest and, theoretically, instant death. The United States is the country most synonymous with electrocution, having used it extensively throughout the 20th century. Although lethal injection is now the primary method, some states still offer that electric chair as an option, and a handful of them retain it as a backup method. Now, this is intended to be swift and relatively painless, but electrocution has often been anything but that. One of the most famous incidents occurred on July 8, 1999, in Florida during the execution of Alan Lee Davis. This guy was convicted of murdering a pregnant woman and her 2 children, and he was sentenced to death by electric chair. His execution, however, went horrifyingly wrong. As that current surged through his body, witnesses were met with a disturbing scene. Blood poured from his nose, and his face turned bright red as burns formed on his head and leg, later known as Bloody Allen for his gruesome end. His case became a flashpoint for debates on whether electrocution constituted a cruel and unusual punishment. Graphic photos of his execution were leaked, sparking outrage and a lot of legal challenges. But despite its decline in use, the electric chair continues to symbolize the dark complexities of capital punishment. Critics often argue that even in cases of heinous crimes, methods like electrocution often fail to meet the humane standard they were designed to uphold. For many of its fans, it remains a stark reminder of justice being served, though at what cost to society's moral conscience? If we're writing a list of the oldest forms of execution around the globe, hanging would definitely be on that, as it dates back thousands of years. Its simplicity made it a common practice across many cultures, as it has been used to enforce justice for crimes ranging from theft to treason. By the Middle Ages, hanging was often carried out in public squares to serve as a grim warning. It's a pretty simple process. Hang the person by the neck with the intent of causing either a quick death through cervical fracture or asphyxiation. The United Kingdom was historically synonymous with hanging, employing it as the primary method of execution until 1964. However, in modern times, countries like Iran have carried out this practice with disturbing regularity. Iran leads the world in hangings now, often conducting them publicly, underscoring its continued use as both a legal and symbolic punishment. Though hanging is supposed to be efficient, it has often been anything but that. One of the most haunting incidents would occur on July 13, 1955. During the execution of Ruth Ellis in England. Now, Ellis was the last woman to be hanged in the UK, being convicted of killing her lover, David Blakely, in a crime of passion. The execution was carried out at Holloway Prison, where Ellis was led to the gallows. Now, what makes this case so tragic isn't just the method, but the public reaction. Ellis was a young mother, and her crime was seen by many as a desperate act fueled by an abusive relationship. Public sentiment was so strong that her hanging ignited debates about capital punishment and its morality. Her composed demeanor at the gallows left a chilling impression, and her death became a catalyst for change. Then we have some other cases where botched hangings had turned executions into prolonged ordeals. A drop that's too short can lead to a slow strangulation, while one that's too long can result in decapitation, with graphic outcomes that highlight the method's flaws. So while hanging remains in use in some parts of the world, including India and Japan, its brutal history does still raise serious ethical questions. Can justice ever truly be served through such a method? Cases like Ruth Ellis's remind us of the human cost behind the gallows, sparking discussions that continue to shape how societies view the death penalty today. From as early as the 15th century, the firing squad has long been a method of execution tied to military justice and acts of treason, with its origins rooted in the practical need to swiftly and efficiently eliminate threats during wartime. Now, this method involves a group of shooters aiming at the condemned person or inmate, typically at the heart, ensuring death through rapid blood loss or organ failure. For centuries, it was favored for its simplicity and perceived dignity, offering the condemned an opportunity to face death upright and often blindfolded. Now, the United States, particularly Utah, is one of the few modern nations to use the firing squad in civilian context. Though rare, Utah kept this option available, viewing it as a way to honor certain inmates' requests or circumvent debates over the ethics of other methods, like the lethal injection. Globally, North Korea is often linked to firing squad executions, where it's used as a brutal tool of repression rather than formal justice. But despite its relative straightforwardness, the firing squad has its own dark history of botched executions. One of the most horrifying cases would happen back on March 23, 1960, in Utah of all places, during the execution of convicted murderer Gary Gilmore. Sentenced for killing a gas station attendant and a motel clerk, Gilmore chose the firing squad as his method of execution. Now, while his death was technically efficient, 5 shooters fired simultaneously, with at least one bullet striking his heart, it is the surrounding context that makes his case so infamous. Gilmore's execution was the first in the U.S. after a nearly 10-year hiatus following a temporary suspension of the death penalty. His case would spark nationwide debates about the morality and necessity of capital punishment. But what makes the firing squad so haunting is the emotional toll it takes not only on the condemned, but also on the executioners. Often, only one rifle is loaded with live ammunition, while others would fire blanks, intending to leave the executioners uncertain about who actually delivered the fatal shot. A system designed to preserve their peace of mind, but one that raises serious moral complexities. Now, many advocates argue that the firing squad is quicker and less prone to failure than many other methods, like lethal injection, but critics are quick to point out its inherently violent and archaic nature. The image of a person standing against the wall, awaiting a barrage of bullets, remains one of the most chilling symbols of capital punishment ever known. Emerging out of the early 20th century, the gas chamber method was introduced as a modern alternative to hanging or electrocution. Now, its first recorded use would be in Nevada in 1924, when Guy John, a convicted murderer, became the first person to die by lethal gas. Now, the method was intended to be more humane, relying on cyanide gas to cause unconsciousness and death through respiratory failure. The inmate would be sealed inside an airtight chamber, and a chemical reaction, often involving sodium cyanide and sulfuric acid, would release the lethal fumes. Now, the U.S. is most associated with the gas chamber, where it would become a staple in states like California and Mississippi during the mid-20th century. Although the gas chamber has largely been replaced by lethal injection, some states still allow it as an option. Now, this was supposed to be a less painful death, but the gas chamber's notoriety proves it's anything but. One of the most harrowing cases we have is on April 6, 1992, during the execution of Donald Eugene Harding in Arizona. Harding was convicted of killing 2 men and was subjected to what many witnesses described as a prolonged and agonizing death. When the cyanide was released, Harding immediately began gasping for air, his body convulsing violently, his face contorted in pain as he struggled against his restraints. Witnesses reported that it took over 10 minutes for him to pass out, with his labored breathing audible throughout the execution chamber. The disturbing spectacle led several witnesses to leave the room in shock. Harding's execution reignited fierce debates about the cruelty of the gas chamber. Critics would point out the method caused intense physical suffering, with inmates often remaining conscious for several minutes, enduring excruciating pain as their lungs burned. Today, the gas chamber is nearly obsolete, used sparingly and only in a few states. However, its chilling history and incidents like Donald Harding's execution remain seared in public memory. One of the oldest and most brutal methods of execution, often associated with adultery, blasphemy, or other perceived moral violations, is stoning. It's pretty simple. You have a group of people throw stones at a condemned person until they die. And what makes this particularly horrifying is its slow and agonizing nature, because those stones are intentionally chosen to be small enough to prolong suffering, but large enough to inflict severe pain. Now, historically, stoning has roots in ancient legal codes, including those in the Middle East and North Africa. It's mentioned in religious texts like the Bible and the Quran, although interpretations of its necessity vary widely. Today, stoning remains legal in some countries, but it's most notoriously associated with Iran, where it's still occasionally implemented despite international outcry. In fact, Iran's penal code explicitly outlines the procedure, specifying that men are buried to their waists and women to their chests before the execution begins. This ensures they cannot escape. One of the most harrowing incidents of stoning occurred in 2004 in Iraq, Iran. A woman named Atefe Saale was executed for alleged crimes against chastity. Now, her tragic case became a global symbol of the brutality of this punishment. Atefe's trial was marred by glaring legal irregularities, including the judge reportedly passing personal judgment on her behavior. This poor girl was buried chest deep, her cries drowned out by the jeers of onlookers as stones rained down on her fragile body. The execution ignited a global outcry, with activists condemning the inhumane nature of stoning and the blatant miscarriage of justice. Stoning's continued use highlights a troubling tension between traditional practices and modern human rights standards. And while international pressure has led to some reforms, such as unofficial bans in several countries, advocates argue that much more has to be done to eradicate it entirely. Beheading, or chopping your head off as some may know it, has long been a method of execution that both captures horror and fascination. Now, this form of capital punishment was historically seen as a swift and honorable death for those of noble status. However, its brutal and graphic nature has also made it a symbol of absolute authority and fear. Looking at it, the practice of chopping one's head off dates back to thousands of years and was commonly used in ancient civilizations like Mesopotamia, Greece, and Rome. During the medieval period, it became a standard punishment for crimes like treason, rebellion, and even adultery. In Europe, they would chop it off usually with a sword or an axe. But then the guillotine became infamous during the French Revolution, making the process chillingly efficient. In modern times, Saudi Arabia is associated with these choppings as a method of execution under the country's interpretation of Sharia law. It's used for offenses like murder, drug trafficking, and apostasy. Executions are often carried out publicly, intended as a deterrent and a stark reminder of the consequences of breaking the law. Now, one of the most horrifying incidents happened in Saudi Arabia in 2019. A mass execution saw 37 individuals lose their heads in a single day, with one of the most tragic cases being that of Mutaba al-Swekat, arrested as a teenager for participating in anti-government protests. Mutaba was accused of spreading chaos and subjected to severe torture before being forced to confess. Despite international pleas for clemency, his execution unfortunately went forward. The cruelty of this method lies not just in its physical violence, but also in its psychological impact. Public executions aim to instill fear and submission, turning justice into a public spectacle. The case of Mutaba certainly drew global condemnation, sparking debates about human rights and ethical responsibilities of nations engaged with Saudi Arabia. Certainly, losing your head as a method of execution has its roots in history, but its continued use today does raise significant moral questions. While proponents argue for its deterrent effect, opponents highlight the inhumanity and injustice often tied to its application. Now, throughout the course of history, being boiled alive has to be one of the most horrific methods of execution ever devised. The condemned would be submerged in a large cauldron or vat of boiling liquid, be it water, oil, or even molten metal, causing excruciating and unimaginable pain as their body burned from the outside in. Now, the brutal punishment was designed to maximize suffering and serve as a warning to whoever dares to break the law. Now, the origins have been dated back to ancient times. Records take it back to Mesopotamia, where those guilty of heinous crimes were subjected to this grisly fate. During the medieval period, it gained notoriety in Europe, particularly in England, under the reign of King Henry VIII. In 1531, Henry made boiling alive the punishment for poisoning after the case of Richard Roos, a cook who laced the bishop's porridge with poison. Roos was boiled alive in public, a chilling spectacle meant to show others what would become of them if they tried that. Historically, boiling alive wasn't limited to Europe. Some parts in Asia, like Japan, during the Sengoku period, we had boiling sometimes used against criminals and prisoners of war. However, no country used it systematically or frequently, as it's kinda gruesome, and it would often invoke revulsion, even in an era of brutal punishments. But one of the most infamous incidents occurred in Uzbekistan during the late 1990s. Under the regime of Islam Karimov, a political prisoner, Muzaffar Avazov, was accused of being a part of a banned Islamic group and was subjected to some horrific treatment before being placed in boiling water. That wasn't just a personal tragedy, but a stark example of state-sponsored cruelty. When his body was returned to his family, the evidence of burns and scalding was unmistakable, leading to international condemnation. Boiling had eventually faded as societies evolved and sought to adopt more humane methods of execution. However, its stark legacy lingers as a reminder of how justice systems can descend into cruelty. And now, something to leave you in shock, we have death flights, standing out as some of the most horrifying and clandestine methods of execution. You see, here we have victims being thrown from airplanes, helicopters, or any other aircraft, often while still alive, into vast bodies of water, or even remote wilderness areas. Now, this method of execution isn't just about ending a life. It is designed to erase the individual completely, leaving no trace behind. This grim practice became infamous during the Dirty War in Argentina between 1976 and 83. The military dictatorships used death flights as a tool to eliminate political dissidents, students, journalists, or anyone suspected of opposing the regime. Victims were often drugged or bound and then loaded onto an aircraft under the guise of being transferred to detention centers. Once airborne, they were thrown out over the Atlantic Ocean or even Rio de la Plata. This ensured no bodies would be found, denying families any form of closure. Although Argentina is most associated with death flights, the method has been reported in other countries, including Chile under Augusto Pinochet's regime, and Indonesia during the anti-communist purges. One of the most harrowing cases we have is with Argentine journalist Rodolfo Walsh, known for exposing human rights abuses. Walsh disappeared in 1977. Evidence suggested that he was taken to a detention center and then later subjected to a death flight. His body, like thousands of others, was never recovered. The scale of these atrocities throughout Argentina was immense. It estimated that up to 30,000 people disappeared during the Dirty War, with many of these victims meeting their end through death flights. Survivors from detention centers later recounted the chilling process, describing how prisoners were told they were being released, only to be sedated, shackled, and thrown to their deaths. These death flights were meant to instill widespread fear. By making people disappear without a trace, regimes sought to crush opposition and create an atmosphere of absolute terror. While death flights represent a particularly cruel form of execution, they also symbolize the resilience of those who fought for justice against unimaginable odds. When you hear the word crucifixion, even though you're not a religious scholar, the first name that comes to mind is Jesus Christ, right? Well, crucifixion is one of the most infamous methods of execution, known for its sheer cruelty and symbolic weight. The condemned are nailed or tied to a wooden cross, and then left to hang until death, which can take hours or even days. This form of execution inflicts excruciating pain, as the weight of the body causes unbearable strain on the limbs and chest, eventually leading to asphyxiation. Now, historically, crucifixion was used by ancient civilizations like the Persians, Carthaginians, and most famously, the Romans. It would be a public spectacle meant to humiliate and deter others from defying authority. Now, the victim was often paraded throughout the streets before being nailed to the cross, making the punishment as much about psychological domination as physical suffering. Now, today, crucifixion is rarely used, but it does remain a legal punishment in Saudi Arabia under specific interpretations of Sharia law, typically reserved for crimes like murder or acts of terror. It is used symbolically, with the body displayed on a cross post-execution. However, in some cases, actual crucifixion is carried out, which does draw global condemnation. The most well-known crucifixion in history is, of course, that of Jesus Christ, which occurred in Roman-occupied Judea around 30 to 33 AD. However, a modern incident that shocked the world occurred in Saudi Arabia in 2019. A man named Abdul Khalek al-Banawi was executed and crucified for charges related to murder and armed robbery. His body was publicly displayed on a cross as a warning to others, and that would draw widespread criticism from human rights organizations, which tried highlighting the method's inhumanity and its place in contemporary society. Crucifixion's symbolic weight has endured throughout centuries, not only for its brutality, but also for its deep cultural and religious significance. For Christians, the crucifixion of Jesus represents the ultimate sacrifice and redemption, while for others, it remains a stark reminder of humanity's capacity for cruelty. The agony of crucifixion lies not just in the physical torment, but also in the deliberate public humiliation. Victims are stripped of their dignity, left exposed for all to see, making it the punishment designed to break both the body and spirit. Though crucifixion is now largely a relic of history, its occasional use in modern times reminds us of the tension between justice, cultural traditions, and evolving human rights standards. It's a haunting legacy that continues to spark debate and reflection on the ethics of punishment as a whole.